California. So the overview for today, we're going to touch on quite a few different topics, and we're going to make sure we leave enough time for a Q&A at the end. So we'll talk about what makes a strong applicant, and then how do you research a program? What's the timeline to apply? Advice for helping you excel on your audition rotations. And we'll also touch on a few things that you'll want to start thinking about, particularly in the spring of your third year, such as personal statements, asking for letters of recommendation. And then finally, we'll touch on how the program signaling works. So making a strong applicant for orthopedic surgery, there is a lot of components, and we could spend hours talking through each of these, but I want to highlight some of the key takeaways. So one of them is your board scores and your grades. They do matter. When you think about applying, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be of similar, academic status. And so it's really important that you are at least within kind of the average, if not higher. I can tell you for like our program, for example, we look at is a person within the top 10%, top 25% quartile, and we note all of those things. We also note everyone's board scores, whether or not they took COMLEX, USMLE, and all of those things play a big role. Now, of course, sometimes we have applicants who maybe don't have the best scores, but they have phenomenal letters of recommendation and they did amazing on their audition rotations. And that, of course, is going to play a heavy weight. So even if you don't necessarily have the best board scores, that doesn't automatically mean that you won't be a competitive applicant, but it certainly makes it much more challenging for you to be taken seriously, especially with the USMLE and COMLEX level 1 and step 1 becoming pass fail. So research and presentations, this is becoming more and more abundant in large part because of USMLE and COMLEX level 1 and step 1 becoming pass fail. That takes away another metric that can be utilized to help kind of deviate between candidates. And so when it comes to research, that's one of the things with like OrthoLink Scholars, for those of you who aren't familiar, which is one of the goals that I had with creating this platform, is especially coming from a DO school that didn't have any orthopedic faculty, that didn't have any research opportunities kind of abundantly laid out. I'm trying to help create a platform for individuals who are interested in orthopedic surgery that don't necessarily have those resources easily available. So knowing that being a part of research, doing presentations can be really challenging if your institution doesn't have that easily accessible, but there are absolutely organizations and there are places where you can seek out those opportunities. But it's really important to know that those things are taken with a very high standard, and especially making sure that even if you're doing research that's not relating to orthopedics, the fact that you are showing scholarly activity is very important. One of the most important things is your connections and networking. We had a candidate who applied and they had one of the most impressive board scores that like we've ever seen, almost a perfect USMLE score and COMLEX scores. However, when they came for their audition, they were argumentative. They were not enjoyable to be around at all. And so that candidate was not even put on the rank list. And so my point being is that your interpersonal relationships, how you interact with other people, are absolutely essential. You are not able to just have great board scores or have a great CV, and that's going to be enough to get you into a program. Truly going out into conferences or finding ways to reach out to residents, that's all going to help you stand out. And if you have a resident that you've built a connection with, whether it's through a conference or through an audition rotation, that resident can help be your ally to help advocate for you and can make a huge impact. At our program, not only do we have the faculty that will score, people that are going through audition rotations and interviewing, but also the chief residents and all of us residents have input. If a chief resident says that an auditioner did not do a good job, we won't even interview them. So that's another important factor to think about, is your interpersonal skills. And so that really ties into the importance of being a team player, being dependable. And this really translates into not just doing well on your orthopedic or your surgery rotations. One of the things that's important is thinking about if you're on your psychiatry rotation, your pediatrics rotation, maybe things that don't necessarily excite you. It's a red flag if we see applicants that had low scores and then also poor reviews from those rotations. So really maximizing each rotation, not only so you can do well on all of your different exams, but also to make sure that consistently we can see that You are not someone who only works hard when you're interested. You're someone who is consistent and has a good attitude, regardless of what team or situation you're put into. The next big component is leadership. It can be very challenging to balance studying for boards, making sure you're doing good in all of your examinations, and also trying to find time to volunteer and being involved in a leadership role. But it is something that can help you stand out. And one of the advice that I give out to a lot of people that has really helped people with getting into orthopedic surgery and staying on interviews is finding a leadership role that you are not only passionate about, but you're with long term. Something that stands out is, let's say you're in a leadership role that isn't necessarily orthopedics, but you do it for 2 to 3 years. That oftentimes is going to make you stand out and have more weight compared to if you did a leadership role for 6 months, then another one for 2 months, and you kind of did a lot of things. That tends to show that you don't have as much commitment. So really knowing that, it doesn't necessarily matter that the leadership role is orthopedic specific, but making sure that you are maximizing opportunities to really show dedication to whatever that leadership role is. And then ultimately finding that commitment to specialty. That can be going to orthopedic conferences, that can be presenting with orthopedic papers or working with residents. All of these factors combined are going to help set you up to be a strong applicant for orthopedic surgery.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Janae said there. We're going to start by talking a little bit more about board prep. I'm not sure if we have a mixture of first, second, third years, so we'll kind of take it from early didactics. But as you enter medical school, it's important to kind of have an idea of what specialty you want to go into, particularly if it's orthopedic surgery, because grades do matter. Different programs have pass fail or pass high pass honors type setups. Our program does that similar thing. So try to maximize your transcript on paper. Not creating red flags is a good place to start early on. Going into it with a foresight that what you're studying day in and day out is going to help you with step one. And it's been said time and time again how well you do on step one is predictive of how well and competitive you can do on step two. With step one being pass fail now, it is very important to pass it on your first try. Some people may think that passing it is going to be a cakewalk. And for those who have taken it already, you know, when studying for it and taking those practice exams, it's not necessarily the most easy test. You take the practice test and you don't end up where you think you'll be at the beginning. So you actually do have to study very hard for it. If you do fail that, it can be a huge setback in your application to surgery, especially orthopedic surgery, because there are so few metrics in which they can evaluate applicants. Studying for that will look like approximately 6 to 8 week period of time where you'll call dedicated, where you'll sit down and solely study for that. Resources commonly used are things like Sketchy, Pathoma, Boards and Beyond, things that are very commonly used during the first 2 years of didactics. Moving more so to step two, level two scores, if you're considering strongly applying to orthopedic surgery, I would definitely take step two. There's not enough data out there to suggest osteopathic students are safe to only take COMLEX. We just don't know the lay of the land. And if you're going to be applying to traditionally allopathic programs as well, the step two score kind of gives a better metric that's more tried and true. Programs and program directors know how to compare that score to other applicants more so than COMLEX. So definitely consider taking that. Unfortunately, it is a double financial burden, and you are going to have to take the board exams twice. It'll be about 18 hours of testing throughout whatever week that is. Studying for step two, luckily for me, and I know a lot of my colleagues that went through it, it was actually less painful than step one. The key to step two, from what I found in talking to others around, is not so much using all these other resources like Pathoma, Sketchy, all that stuff. It's solely just repping out UWorld. So during clinical rotations, you usually study for shelf exams using ComBank or UWorld. I tried to just use UWorld. I went into it knowing that every shelf I was going to take, I'm studying basically for step two. I had that in mind the whole time. That's going to help you hopefully honor your shelf exams, but also going to set you up come step two, because you'll have hopefully made a full first pass through UWorld at that time. Some people use Anki. I used Anki sparingly throughout the first 2 years, and kind of as the summers came on, I didn't keep up with it. During third year, I didn't use Anki at all until I got into my dedicated study time for step two. How I used it, which I found helpful, was I would do all my UWorld tests, all my ComBank tests, everything like that, rigorously go through it like you do for step one. But I'll take screenshots of all the missed questions, and I'll put those screenshots directly into Anki, and then make an Anki deck of everything that I missed. Only the things that I missed, or even if I got it right and I didn't think I got it right for the right reason, I would put it in there. That way, it's all about keeping it fresh in your mind. You're not going to remember everything that you study for step two. It's just so much material. So it's about keeping it fresh, keeping it familiar. I think I was trying to do up to 200 questions a day, which was a lot, a little too much sometimes. I was trying to read on Reddit. You'll find a bunch of things about 50 to 100 questions a day, up to 200. But my goal was to really just see as many questions as possible. I'm forgetting the name of it, but there's also these sheets. If anyone remembers, help fill in, but they're more so geared towards the MD shelf exams, but I studied those a lot, which I found particularly helpful for STEP. So I focused more so on my STEP score. I didn't do anything specifically for COMLEX. I probably studied for about 3 days for OMM specifically. I took STEP before COMLEX, and I just used that time to study OMM, kind of like I did for step one. I found that to be okay. But my main goal was that step score, because programs know how to use that more. But I guess the synopsis of board studying, especially for third years, about halfway through, is, as you're going into these last 6 months before you take it, if you haven't been, or even if you have been, just keep it in the back of your mind as you're starting to get a little more tired out. If you go through hard rotations, that you're studying for these shelf exams, everything is studying for step two. So just stay on the gas, and I think it'll pay off for you guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Logan. So just to highlight kind of a general timeline into fourth year. So with your June time, that's normally when a lot of people will start taking their level two, step two, get academic study months. Obviously, this is going to vary depending on your school. Most sub-Is are going to be around like July through September, and some of them will go into like December. And we'll talk more in this presentation about the timing of those. With that, you have to keep in mind that your ERAS is going to be in September. So one of the challenging things is you start on sub-Is and then you realize, oh, I haven't kept up with getting my letters of recommendation. I haven't started a draft of my personal statement. And now you're in the middle of sub-Is trying to get your ERAS application done. So it's really important to keep that in mind, that ideally before you start your sub-Is, you already have drafts of the components that you'll want for your ERAS. When it comes to interviews, most of the orthopedic interviews now are being done under this system where in November everyone tells you, did you get an interview or not? They're giving it like a standard day. I don't know if they're going to continue in the future. Most likely they will. But that can make it pretty challenging, because while all your other colleagues in other specialties are already potentially starting interviews, you're kind of sitting high and dry. Do I get orthopedic interviews? Maybe you've applied to a backup specialty and you're starting interviews in that regard while on auditions. Most of the orthopedic interviews are going to be typically in January and February. I know when I did my interviews, it was during COVID and it was virtual. I had some that started in December, but again, things really vary. And so it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of the interviews are probably going to be similar to each other. I know Logan has like 4 interviews that are basically like day after each other, all in the same week. And so just keep in mind that that's going to be a big component. And then February is when your rank list is going to be due. And then March is ultimately when you have match day.
Okay, so when it comes to finding programs, I think it's never too early to go through the resources if you know that you're interested in orthopedics, but especially at the beginning of your third year, I think is a great time to go through some of these resources. The NRMP puts out data on programs, but also applicant statistics. If you haven't viewed those, the link is on this PowerPoint. But I think it's something good to reference in terms of looking at programs, but also looking at your application as well and determining your competitiveness to what programs historically have matched in the past. For me, what I did at the beginning of third year or throughout third year was actually I downloaded a list of all of the programs that participated in ERAS, which you can find on AAMC. And I kind of used that as a guide to select programs or check off programs that I was interested in, made a preliminary list of programs that I was more or less interested in, depending on what your goals for residency are. And so I think that's also a good time to think about what's important to me in a program. Things like training, number of residents that are at the program, I think is something to look into. Additionally, if you have a specific subspecialty in mind, that's something that you can look into in the program. Whether you want to be at a community focused program or an academic program is something to consider when you're looking at programs as well. And then I think location is an additional component to residency program search as well. And so the residency map is a good tool for that if that's something that you're interested in looking at location wise. With the ERAS application now selecting 3 areas of, I guess, choice of residency location and determining that on your application, you can kind of search for programs within those regions as well. And so I think overall, at the beginning of third year, at the minimum, is a good place to start looking through programs and just becoming familiar with what programs offer, what the number of residents, if you are looking for diversity in the program, female residents, minority representation, things like that. All of those can be found through these different websites here. And then in terms of elective searches, so we talked a little bit about audition rotations, and I know Logan will talk about it a little bit more later on, but determining which programs to do those audition or sub internship rotations at are going to be very specific to you and what you're looking for in a residency program. And so I think going back to really diving into those things personally will help you go through your elective search. And so finding those programs, and I would say coming up with your top 10, 15 programs that you're interested in and putting those at the forefront at the beginning of third year and kind of looking through VSLO or Clinician Nexus is another application that they do audition rotation applications through, and at least going through and finding out what do these programs require. Some programs will have letter of recommendation requirements, will have board score requirements, transcript requirements, essay requirements, personal statement requirements. So those types of things are something to think about early on in third year. And I think something else to also point out here at the very bottom, the bottom red arrow that mentions for more information, please click here. I think that's something to definitely focus on when you're searching through elective rotations, because there may be additional requirements on that program's website that they want to know that you've gone through and are taking the time to look through their program and see those additional requirements. So definitely go through that thoroughly and make sure that you have those requirements, at least that you're thinking about them if you have not fulfilled them already. And so early in third year is a good place to start looking, and you can save these. Most, I would say, open around the January. There were a couple that opened in December. So I think if you're in your third year or if you're in your second year prepping for that, but even if you're in your third year now and you haven't started yet, I think that's okay. I think doing that now and going through at this point is still beneficial, and there are still plenty of programs that are open at this point for applications.
Perfect, great points, Quincy. Another thing to consider is that there's sometimes programs such as my program in Modesto that doesn't necessarily utilize the AAMC website like the VLSO. So sometimes, like Quincy was saying, it's really important you take a step back and look at all the different programs that might be in the region or that have the certain characteristics, and make sure that you're not missing out on potentially their website or an audition site for them. Like with our program, you have to go to our website and then apply through our website. And so that could be potentially a way that you might miss out, especially on deadlines. So just know that you, again, have to be strategic about looking at different resources. So I'll share this link. This is from 2023, and it basically has a compilation of DO ortho programs, and then also has some allopathic programs that have had DOs match in the past. So I'll share that with you all, so you guys can look at it. Make sure that you guys take this kind of information and modify it to be your own. So this is an example of a screenshot from what I did with my orthopedic residencies. So essentially, I made mine initially geographic with like West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, Southwest, etc. And then I would put in like the links to all of the different websites so it's easily accessible. Whether or not there was, any particular notes, like maybe they had a webinar or something that I attended. So all of that information was a way for me to kind of keep organized. And then ultimately, I was keeping track of, were there places that I had applied to, places that I maybe made a more personalized personal statement. So however you want to do it, make sure that you are starting to keep that organized, because otherwise it's extremely overwhelming to keep track of all the information. This was then kind of the next step, is once I had my, list of interviews, was then taking all that data I previously had and expanding on it. So this was, for example, University of New Mexico, one of the places I interviewed at. And I just kept note of what are the things that stood out about the program through my interviews, and then also what I found online. It helped me not only prepare for my interviews, but it also helped me when thinking about how am I going to create this rank list, and how am I going to really weigh what are my options for the different places that I interviewed at.
Yeah, and before I talk about audition rotations, I just want to emphasize that one Excel document with all of the osteopathic orthopedic programs. I thought that was an extremely helpful resource to know when programs typically open. I remember as a third year, I went to one of the conferences in Colorado Springs, and I hadn't started thinking about when to apply for our audition rotations. And I was actually talking with some fourth years who showed me that document. And it turned out I had to really start considering it, because some of them open January 1st. And some of them, I was told, close very quickly within 2 days of opening. So getting your applications in early, especially for programs that are high on your list, is very important. And that kind of leads into audition rotations. So I'm sure you've all heard by now, but audition rotations are kind of the bread and butter of maximizing your chances of maxing or matching into orthopedic surgery, especially in the osteopathic environment. What this looks like is you work basically like an intern for a month. There are options for 4-week rotations and sometimes 2-week rotations, though from my experience of what I've heard, 4-week rotations are typically preferable. As you may know, going through your own rotations, once you hit that 3rd week, you kind of start to get your stride, start to understand the lay of the land a little bit more. Most applicants are aiming for around 4 to 6 audition rotations. Some people have difficulty getting their school to approve more than 16 weeks of one elective. There are potentially ways around that, so I would talk with your school program coordinators to see if they have any experience in working around that. And like they were talking, the VSAS or VSLO is how I think I applied for about half of mine. I did not apply for any orthopedic surgery ones through Clinician Nexus. Most of the other ones came directly through emailing program coordinators or from the website, and that's all information I found directly from the Excel sheet that Janae previously mentioned. So when you're on audition rotations, when you're planning them, you typically need to find your own housing and own transportation. So for me, I stayed with residents, I think, at 3 out of my 5 rotations. You can find that typically when the program will send out a document of all residents who have available rooms, or if you know residents at that program who may have an extra room for you to stay at. If you don't have that option and the program hasn't sent out any housing information or residents who are offering up housing, you can go through things like Airbnb, which tends to be one of the more expensive options, rotating room, I haven't used that one personally, but I have used Furnished Finder for one of my rotations during third year, and that typically can be a good option. They tend to screen some of their living situations more rigorously, so you're not necessarily going to end up in a compromising location. Regarding audition rotations, though, you can expect to be at the hospital at around 5 a.m. and you leave when the work is done. So sometimes you can get out as early as 3 to 4 p.m., but it's not uncommon to stay until 7 or 8 p.m. if surgeries run late. You are there to make an impression. You're there to show how you're a good team member, how you're able to work hard, how you're able to learn from mistakes. You're not expected to know everything, and you are going to get asked a lot of questions that you don't know. Some of the resources that we'll talk about in the following slides, I'll get into that in a second, but kind of the general approach to this audition rotation is that it's a 1 month interview. You go into it every day. And then when you get home, particularly, I want to emphasize if you're staying with residents, when you get home, you are still on interview. There have been many of stories I've heard from residents that have had students stay with them that have maybe not been ideal to live with, and it has impacted them in a negative manner. So that is something to be conscious of as you are going through this process, that everybody is always kind of watching what you're doing, and it is tiring. It is an exhausting process, constantly being on evaluation, but that's kind of part of the rigor and the perseverance of the process. So some of the main resources that are used, I mainly use OrthoBullets, I use Pocket Pimped, I use Netters, and then I use Anki because there is a deck that combines OrthoBullets, Pocket Pimped, Netters, and as well as another resource that's not listed on here called Hip and Knee Book. Clinical rotation expectations, you're going to want to talk with residents at the beginning. I usually ask about what are the expectations regarding call schedule? How can I be helpful in the OR? Do they prefer me to um, help with any sort of charting, pre-rounding, getting the list up to date? Some programs have done that, some programs haven't done that. In clinic, am I expected to write notes? How can I be helpful in clinic? Trying to be as proactive as possible, understanding not only your goals, but what the residents and attendings at that program view a good rotator as doing. And then also considering if this is a place that you want to get a letter of recommendation from. If you're going to be rotating later in the season, it's unlikely that a letter of recommendation will be significantly helpful because you'll probably have already submitted your application. Um, but kind of how I approach learning early on, especially in these orthopedic surgery rotations, particularly at the end of your third year, if it may be your first rotation, is knowing ahead of time what cases are going to be going in your OR and then studying mostly the relevant surgical anatomy. If you aren't sure where to start, anatomy is always the best place to start. There are so many nuances of surgical anatomy that are different from what you may have learned during your first and second year, and getting a feel for what we value and what you are looking for, not only as approach wise, but what you're avoiding is a particularly useful place to start. Pocket Pimped, if you don't have Pocket Pimped or haven't heard of Pocket Pimped, it's something that you should definitely get. It is very, very useful, particularly for knowing what you should already know about a procedure before you go into it. It's about 1,500 questions, and I have been asked a majority of my questions from residents and in the OR and attendings from this book. Also, help out with everything. Nothing is beneath you. If you are in an OR and there's other students that are scrubbed in and you're not scrubbed in, being attentive, helping prepare the room, helping get the patient in the room, transferring them, helping clean up the room after, finding ways to be helpful. If you are standing there with your hands in your pockets and aren't sure what to do, helping nurses out and the OR staff is always an excellent place to go. It will never get you in the wrong. Stay late until the end of the case. Don't leave in the middle of a case. If it's 5 p.m. and you've been there all day and somebody else is on call, but you've been in the OR all day, you should probably stay till the end of the case. I like to try to stay until the patient is at least extubated or until the patient leaves the room. I make it an emphasis not to ever leave the OR, especially before one of the residents you're working with leaves the room. So in general, just be early, stay late, and don't be late for any of your rotations. Give yourself extra time. These are new hospitals every month. You may not know the city. There may be traffic you're not anticipating, so plan extra. Nothing can hurt you more than being late multiple times. It can look bad and get you written off, despite having a strong application and performing otherwise well.
Okay. And then before I get into letters of recommendation, I also wanted to add to Logan's information. I agree with everything he said. I also think practicing your suturing before your first rotation is a good place to start as well, or watch some YouTube videos about one-handed and two-handed ties, practicing suturing, even if it's on one of the kits. I think just kind of getting back into a rhythm of using your hands before your first rotation, I think is a really good idea. When it comes to letters of recommendation, ask letter writers early. I think especially in third year, if you are going into your third year or in your third year now, I think making it a point to try to get a letter of recommendation from every rotation that you're at. Of course, you're not going to go into every specialty that you're going into, but going in with that mindset will not only help you do well on the rotation, but also make a connection with those preceptors. And then going back to applying for those audition rotations or elective rotations, some will require a letter of recommendation, and you'll be in your third year needing a letter of recommendation that early. So I think that's a good place to start is during third year. And it's also a good time to practice asking for letters of recommendation, because I think that sometimes can be an intimidating thing to ask for and practice asking for. And so being able to do that early on, I think is a good skill to have. Along with that is having a CV ready. When you ask for a letter of recommendation, have one printed out. That way, if they do ask for a copy, you're able to give them one. Of course, if they ask for an email or something like that, I think that's reasonable as well. Asking if they can write a strong letter of recommendation. I think directly asking that is something that is appropriate. I also think when you go through and ask for expectations at the beginning of your rotation, and you check in the middle, you check in at the end, I think you can get a good amount of feedback from your preceptor, and the way that they are able to give you feedback. Are you receiving a lot of positive feedback? Do they feel like they're really encouraged to help you succeed? I think those are great places throughout your rotation to assess, do I think this preceptor would write me a strong letter of recommendation? Most programs, when you apply to orthopedic surgery, will accept between 3 and 4. I think the trend over the last couple of years has been to try to get as many as you can from an orthopedic surgeon, just because they can speak directly to your skills and, of course, you as an applicant into orthopedic surgery. But I also think if you connect with a preceptor from a different specialty and they can write you a very strong letter of recommendation, they can, they have assessed and can speak to your work ethic and how you get along with patients with a part of the team. I think that is also beneficial. Something new, especially, and Logan, if you want to add to this as well, but slows have been added to the orthopedic surgery field as well in terms of applications. And so that's something also to look for when you're submitting or looking for programs on your ERAS is, does this program require a standard letter of evaluation in terms of orthopedic surgery? Because that will need to come from an orthopedic surgeon. And so having that on your radar, even in third year and towards the beginning of fourth year, I think is important. If you have more than 3 to 4 letters of recommendation, that's okay. You can upload as many letters of recommendation to your application as you want to, and you can actually assign them to different programs. So if you have a region where you have, let's say in California, which is where I'm at currently, if I have positions in the area that have written me a letter of recommendation for programs that are in the area and I want to assign those to those programs and vice versa, that's something that you're able to do. So I think trying to get as many strong letters of recommendation as you can is important during third and fourth year. And then keeping that in the back of your mind in terms of the standard letter of evaluation, I think programs will start to turn towards that in the next couple of years based on what I've seen, at least applying this year.
Sorry, my computer keeps glitching out on me. So personal statements, I help with reviewing a lot of personal statements and can attest to how challenging these can be with writing. So I wanted to highlight a few key things. So one is really taking notes on memorable patients or experiences during your rotations throughout third year. That can help you with really thinking about what's going to make you different. Was there an interaction that you had where maybe you felt like you were really there for the patient and people took notice of it? And it's also important to recognize that just because you're applying orthopedic surgery doesn't mean that the memorable experiences in your personal statement have to be orthopedic surgery. So for example, my opening statement in my personal statement was about working on my grandparents' dairy farm. And then I talked about being a competitive hula dancer. And both of those were things that are very unique to me, that were brought up throughout my interviews. And I got the feedback that my personal statement was not at all the generic, oh, my grandma had a hip fracture, or, oh, I tore my ACL playing soccer, that it was memorable. And then those things that I demonstrated were showing my resilience and my passion for, and perseverance for these activities. So one of the mistakes I see a lot of students make in personal statements I review is that they kind of have generic stories, or they talk about how, I'm very outgoing, I'm resilient, I have grit. But what's more impactful is the stories communicating those attributes. So if you have an experience, maybe you are, someone who English wasn't your first language, or maybe you did an international rotation, or you did something that is unique to you and something that can help you stand out amongst the pack of everyone else applying. Maybe that's a good thing to include in your personal statement. Don't get stuck in thinking I have to write about how I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon because, I sprained my ankle while playing basketball all these years. That just gets lost amongst the thousands of applicants. So really reflect on what's going to make you different. And you want to start writing your draft early in the spring of your third year. I started writing mine actually in the fall of my third year, and then I just kept doing iterations, and I ended up making multiple different personal statements. So I had my generic orthopedic surgery personal statement, but then I had one for my California programs, I had one for my Washington programs, and then vice versa. And for me, it was a way to help personalize it. And then I also modified my personal statements for each audition place that I went to. And that's another way for programs to see, oh, this person took the time and thoughtfulness to really write about why they're interested in our program or why they're interested in our region. Another thing is important is having lots of people review it. I know it's great when we get the feedback, oh, everything looks good, and you have your mom read it and they give you the stamp of approval, but that's not very helpful. So importantly, thinking about reaching out to residents, there's places like MSOS or, the Student Osteopathic Orthopedic Association that have, resources to help connect you to people such as myself to help review personal statements that can give you much more objective feedback. And then again, you want to be authentic and offer unique, genuine points about you. Most personal statements that I read, within the first 4 sentences, you get a pretty strong sense of, is this someone you want to learn more about, or is it not? And so with your personal statements, again, think about what are those attributes or things that are unique to you. And then also reflecting on the fact that your personal statements can vary, and just like your letters of recommendation, you can have different letters depending on the geographic region or connections to a certain area, and then you can also modify your personal statements to that as well.
Okay, and then program signaling. So if you are all not familiar with signaling. So as far as ERAS goes, different specialties have a different number of signals. So a signal is essentially telling a program that you have interest in that program. And so orthopedic surgery specifically has 30. And so it started in 2022, I believe, so the last couple of years. So we're still in the works about how signaling actually, I guess, helps an applicant or how this is going to work out long term. But over the last couple of years, they've done a little bit of research showing that signals have benefited applicants in the sense that if you are unable to do an audition rotation because we only have so much time in our fourth year, right? Doing 4 to 6, maybe 7 if you're able to. But outside of that, how else are we able to show programs that we're interested in attending? And so you have 30 signals, and I think there are a couple different schools of thought in terms of how to utilize those signals. And that really, I think, is very applicant dependent, especially when it comes to your competitiveness and the programs that you're looking into going. And so, number one, the programs that you auditioned at or did a sub internship at, I think most of them are still asking you to signal them. And I think programs that do not want you to signal will explicitly tell you, please do not signal our program if you have rotated here. Otherwise, I think it's smart to continue to signal the programs that you've auditioned at. Outside of those, coming up with your top 30 programs to signal, I think, like I said, is person dependent. Do you want to, would you prefer a community program? Would you want to go to an academic program? I think as an osteopathic applicant, it's also important to determine traditionally osteopathic programs to signal versus traditionally allopathic programs to signal. Of course, there's overlap as well, but I think utilizing some of those signals for reach programs, I think, is a smart idea as well. And something I know Logan and I have talked about is there are some programs that if you are very interested in and you say, I feel like I'm at least on the cusp of being competitive here. This may be a reach for me, but I'm willing to utilize my signals to this program, I think is smart. I think utilizing all 30 for reach programs is probably not ideal, right? And being reasonable with yourself about what programs you are competitive at is something to be honest with yourself, or even ask a mentor or ask other students or residents that you've worked with at your audition rotations prior to September is something that you can do as well, and get their feedback about how they signaled and things like that. And then Dr. Rasmussen wrote on here too that auditions are helpful to get interviews, but if you do well. And so and I'm sure she can speak to this more than I can. But she had written here that, several auditioners did not get interviews that had poor performance. And so an audition does not necessarily equal an interview, and neither does a signal. But I think the orthopedic surgery world has tried to come up with a way to show interest in programs that you're not able to audition at, and also to limit, applying to 700 programs, because I think that's, something that was done historically as well.
Yeah, building off of that, I just dropped a link to a paper out of Baylor that I used when deciding how many programs to apply to. It was published in 2023, but they showed that applicants who didn't signal had less than 1% chance of receiving an interview. So when I was weighing cost benefit analysis of it, me and a lot of my colleagues decided to cap our application to about 30 programs based on what we signaled, and ended up applying to probably about 40 because there are some programs that come through that don't require that. But this paper kind of shed some light on that, which saves some money, which is nice. Additionally, off of what Quincy said, when you're trying to assess if you should do an audition rotation at a REACH program, what I actually did is I reached out to a chief resident at a program I was considering rotating at, and they were grateful enough to kind of ask me for my CV and my stats in consideration, and they gave me honest feedback about whether or not they thought it would be a good idea to rotate at that program. And that's something that I found very meaningful. So I knew if I was going to go, then I wouldn't be completely wasting my time, or I wouldn't be not considered just because I was an osteopathic candidate. So that's an additional option. You can reach out to a program coordinator, get in touch with a current resident, and then just ask them, have a person-to-person conversation.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention with signaling too, our program, if you don't signal, you automatically are not going to be considered for it. And like Logan was saying, more and more programs are starting to do that. So it is a gamble. You only have 30. So again, being very strategic, like Quincy said, where you have to maximize what are programs that are you're more likely to get, whether they're historically osteopathic or places you auditioned at or have connections to, and then also including some that might be more reach programs, but making sure that you have a balance of that within your 30.
And then lastly, I'll finish up quick so we have time for questions, but most interviews, they're back to in person. I know a majority of mine are in person. So trying to avoid scheduling audition rotations into January may be helpful. I'm saying that because I'm currently on an audition rotation in January and have found the difficulty of, trying to not only make a good impression here, but attend all of my auditions, and the travel schedule can be a little hectic. And there are issues with overlap, tight travel schedules. Some interviews may be on the same day and you have to pick one over the other. Always emailing, reaching out to program coordinators can be useful to see if they have alternative dates. And you also may only get interviews from places that you audition. And that is a kind of a common story. And many programs, especially osteopathic programs, only consider candidates who did an audition or signaled them. You're going to want to budget in advance because the cost of these in-person interviews can be approximately up to around $800 to $1,000 after you go through the cost of travel, lodging, car reservations. If you need new suit or any of those extra expenses, it adds up very quickly. And you're not always going to know very far ahead of time if you get an interview at a place. Like Janae was saying earlier, mid-November is when they released most of the interview invites, and some trickled in late as mid-December for early January interviews. So these flights are going to be expensive. They may be across the country, so something to consider. Mock interviews are also important to attempt to do. I know our school does offer opportunities to do mock interviews with the student academic success team. If you know residents or other medical students that you have a good connection with, you can also ask them to participate in a mock interview with you. That can be a very helpful thing instead of just writing out answers to questions, to really put yourself in those shoes and kind of get the first interview fluster out of you.
Awesome. I'm going to talk about some of the key summary points, make sure I have time for questions. But one of the things I wanted to highlight that I thought was a mistake that I made was I have lots of connections with the West Coast. My medical school is in Arizona. I'm from the West Coast, and I did all of my auditions on the West Coast. And so one of the things I noticed was basically all my interviews were all on the West Coast. The farthest east was New Mexico. And I think in hindsight, one of the things that I should have done, thankfully it all worked out, but for advice for you all is if you don't have a connection to the East Coast, for example, or to the West Coast, considering doing an audition rotation in that region, because what that does is it shows one that you have interest in traveling or going to that area and in that program, but also it shows that you're much more flexible. So again, when you're thinking about your auditions, you want to balance what are things that are, osteopathic friendly or places that you have alumni from your school or other connections with, but also maybe there's certain regions of the country that you don't necessarily have connections with, but have programs that you're interested in. Maybe it's worth trying to do one of your auditions in that region. So we talked about a lot of things today. I'm going to send out in the chat some of the links that I had in this presentation for you all to have. But the key takeaways: your scores, your studies absolutely matter. Everything that you're doing on your clinical rotations, treat it as you are studying for level 2 and step 2. Take it seriously, do your questions with UWorld and your other resources consistently. Start looking into programs early. It is not too early to start looking in your second year. Creating an Excel sheet or however you want to organize that data is going to be extremely helpful, and it allows you to continue to build as you learn more information. Making sure that you know your deadlines and materials. One of the links that I had on here was the standard immunization form. A lot of the programs will want to make sure that you're up to date on, Tdap, and you've had a recent flu vaccine, et cetera. And so if you're scrambling and you only see that form 3 weeks before your rotation, you might not be able to go on that rotation simply because you didn't have all your vaccination forms in the proper format that they wanted. So again, really do your due diligence of checking the program's website and whatever resources that you're utilizing to make sure you're not missing any little detail. Looking for mentorship and other opportunities, connecting with residents, whether it's through conferences, resources like OrthoLink Scholars, et cetera, really maximize your opportunities. Asking for letters early and reflecting on who's going to write you a strong letter. Keep track of notable experiences or other things that are going to make you unique, and reflecting what are the aspects that you have that are going to make you stand out to a program. And ultimately remember that medicine is a very small world, and orthopedics is even smaller. Always be kind to people, be accountable, own up to your mistakes, show enthusiasm. You would be surprised how you do on audition at one program, how that communication can even transfer to another program between residents that know each other, et cetera. So just be mindful of all that, and we'll leave it open to questions. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank y'all so much. That was a